Imagine this um, tall, immaculate officer standing on a train platform.
Okay.
He's wearing a spotless uniform, his posture is relaxed, almost, bored. He leans on one elbow, and with the index finger of his free hand, he lazily flicks it to the left or to the right.
Just a casual gesture.
Yeah, just a tiny casual gesture. But in that one microscopic movement, he is literally sentencing thousands of people to death without them even comprehending what is happening. Welcome to the deep dive.
It's a chilling image to start with.
It really is. You see, when we talk about major historical events, we usually look at them from 30,000 feet. We look at the map, we track troop movements, we read these staggering statistics of casualties, and it provides this very clean, macroscopic narrative.
Right, and it creates a buffer for us. Studying the broad structural or systemic shifts of history, it protects us from the suffocating reality of the actual human experience on the ground.
Exactly. But today we are stripping away that buffer entirely. The mission of this deep dive is to zero in on a landscape that is intensely intimate, microscopic, and to be completely honest, profoundly dark.
Yeah.
We're drawing entirely on the first-hand account and the subsequent psychiatric analysis of Viktor Frankl. He survived multiple concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and he went on to create this revolutionary branch of psychology, logotherapy.
And I think here is the critical distinction for today's exploration. We aren't looking at a historical account of the famous martyrs, right, or the prominent political prisoners.
No, not at all.
Frankl's work is fundamentally a psychological autopsy of the ordinary prisoner. We are going to examine the minds of the people who bore no distinguishing marks on their sleeves, the people who suffered the most absolute forms of systemic abuse.
The everyday struggle.
Right. We're going to explore the unrelenting struggle for just a single piece of bread, the multitude of small daily torments, and ultimately, how a human being constructs an internal purpose when everything external is literally designed to obliterate their humanity.
I have to admit, when I was reading through the source material, I really struggled. I mean, how do we even explore this level of trauma without just drowning in the horror of it?
It's a fair question. We explore it because this extreme crucible is perhaps the only environment where we can observe the absolute bedrock of human resilience.
Yeah.
It reveals the survival mechanisms of the human psyche in a way that everyday life simply cannot. If we can understand how dignity is maintained in an absolute abyss, well, we can apply those lessons to the suffering and the existential voids we encounter in our own modern lives.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's start at that train platform. Picture a train carrying 1,500 captives. It has been traveling for days and nights.
Unbearable conditions.
Yeah, you have 80 people shoved into a single coach, lying on top of whatever meager luggage they were allowed to bring. They're completely exhausted, starving, terrified. And suddenly, the train shunts. A cry breaks out in the carriage. Someone peering through a crack has seen a sign, and the sign just says, Auschwitz.
And even then, I mean, that name stood for gas chambers, crematoriums, massacres.
The absolute worst.
Right. The absolute terror of that realization should, logically, break a person's mind instantly. But the brain has this incredible self-preservation mechanism that kicks in immediately when faced with imminent doom.
What's that called?
In psychiatry, we observe a phenomenon known as the delusion of reprieve.
The delusion of reprieve. I've heard of this in other contexts, I think, like a condemned man walking to the gallows who somehow convinces himself that the governor is going to call at the very last possible second.
Yes, exactly that.
Yeah.
It is a fundamental cognitive shield. The reality of imminent death is just too massive for the conscious mind to process all at once. So it latches onto any microscopic shred of hope, however illogical. When the train doors finally fly open, a receiving squad of inmates boards the train. They were wearing stark uniforms, their heads are shaved, but crucially, they look energetic, they look well-fed. They even have this grotesque nervous humor about them.
Right, and Frankl notes that his inborn optimism immediately latched onto this image. His brain essentially told him, like, look, these prisoners look quite well, they're surviving, maybe things aren't as bad as the rumors.
Yes.
He thought, maybe I can share their favorable position.
But the tragedy of that delusion is that these receiving squads were a highly specialized elite. They were kept well-fed specifically because they managed the incoming transports. They were confiscating smuggled jewelry, trading it for liquor, basically just to doke themselves against the unbearable psychological weight of what they were participating in.
Because they had to process the dead.
Right. The new arrivals had zero context for this hierarchy. They were simply told to leave their luggage, separate into men and women, and
Hmm.
file past that senior SS officer we mentioned earlier.
The one doing the finger pointing.
Exactly.
Frankl tries to stand as upright and look as healthy as possible. He's hiding a heavy haversack under his coat, and the officer turns him to the right. But for 90% of the people on that transport, that lazy point to the left was a death sentence.
Carried out within hours.
Right, they were sent directly to the gas chambers.
So for the fraction who survived that first terrifying selection, they are sent to the cleansing station. And this is where the psychological eradication of the former self is systematically executed. We have to understand, this isn't just about taking away possessions. It is a calculated unmaking of a human being.
Everything is stripped. Watches, jewelry, clothes, shoes. There is a deeply poignant moment in the source material where Frankl approaches an older prisoner. Frankl furtively points to a roll of paper hidden in the inner pocket of his coat.
Ah, the manuscript.
Yeah, it's the manuscript of a scientific book, his life's work up to that point. He begs the older man to help him keep it. He actually thinks he can negotiate for a piece of paper.
This perfectly illustrates a clash of two irreconcilable realities. Frankl's brain is still operating under the framework of his former life, a society where intellectual output, a scientific manuscript, commands respect and holds immense value.
It meant everything to him.
Right. The older prisoner, however, has been entirely assimilated into the brutal reality of the camp. To him, the request is not just absurd, it's almost offensively naive.
Right. The older man's face just shifts from a sort of pitying disbelief to outright mockery, and he just bellows a single vulgar word at Frankl.
And that one word completely shatters the delusion. That is the moment it truly hits him. They possess literally nothing but their ridiculously naked existence.
They are stripped of their clothes. They are shaved bare. Not a single hair is left on their entire bodies. They are handed rags. And finally, they are reduced to numbers.
Total erasure.
Yeah, their names, their history, their life's work, their entire identity erased and replaced by a number tattooed on their skin and sewn onto their clothing. The authorities cared about absolutely nothing else.
This total systemic erasure precipitates a massive psychological shock. I mean, the human mind is remarkably adaptable, but an influx of trauma, this absolute, threatens to destroy the psyche entirely.
It's like a house being struck by lightning, right? If there is a massive surge of electricity, the circuit breaker trips. The lights go out, but the house doesn't burn down.
That's a great analogy.
When confronted with and the grim humor that surfaces is so surreal, the prisoners actually laughed with intense relief when they saw that real water dripped from the shower heads and not gas. The relief was so profound, it manifested as laughter.
But we cannot mistake that dissociation and grim humor for actual resilience. It is a temporary emergency protocol. Underneath that tripped circuit breaker lies the crushing weight of utter hopelessness.
Right.
During this initial phase of shock, almost every single prisoner entertained the thought of suicide. The common phrase in the camp was running into the wire, which meant touching the electrically charged barbed wire fence to end it all instantly.
But Frankl didn't do it. In fact, he made a firm promise to himself on his very first evening that he would not run into the wire. How does someone make that calculation in the midst of such profound shock?
Because of that very detachment we just discussed, he applied that cold, grim objectivity to his statistical chances of survival. He looked at the abysmal survival rate and realized that death was looming constantly anyway.
The gas chambers were a daily reality.
Exactly. A prisoner in that first phase of shock didn't even fear the gas chambers anymore, because the gas chamber at least spared him the psychological burden of having to commit suicide. So he decided to let fate take its course, realizing that actively choosing to end his life was functionally redundant.
But a circuit breaker can't stay tripped forever, you know? The mind can't sustain that level of hypervigilant shock indefinitely. What happens when that initial protective layer wears off?
That transitions the prisoner into the second phase of the psychological autopsy, which is profound apathy. After a few days, the shock recedes and it is replaced by an emotional death.
Emotional death.
Yes, this blunting of emotions is the second stage of self-defense. Reality dims. The prisoner's entire cognitive bandwidth becomes aggressively narrowed, focused entirely on the microscopic details of self-preservation.
The normalization of horror during this apathy phase, reading these examples from the source material, actually froze my blood. There is a moment where Frankl is waiting at the sickbay. A 12-year-old boy is carried in.
Oh, that story.
Yeah, the boy had been forced to stand at attention in the snow for hours, with bare feet as a punishment. His toes had become completely frostbitten.
And we have to pay attention to Frankl's internal state in this memory. He stands there, utterly unmoved. He watches the doctor on duty take a pair of tweezers and simply pick off the boy's black, gangrenous stumps, one by one.
God.
The emotions we would expect, disgust, horror, intense pity, the urge to intervene, they simply were not there anymore. The psychological machinery required to generate those emotions had shut down to conserve energy.
I just need to pause for a second because the image of the gangrenous toes is just, well, it's a lot to process, but there is an even more chilling example.
There is.
Frankl is in a hut for typhus patients. A man he was having a conversation with just 2 hours prior dies. Frankl watches without any emotional upset as fellow prisoners immediately strip the warm body. They take its shoes, its coat, a hidden potato.
Utter pragmatism.
Right. Then a nurse grabs the corpse by the ankles and drags it across the bumpy floor. The head of the corpse bumps up the wooden steps with this uncanny, hollow, rattling noise. Frankl is sitting by a window. His cold hands are clasping a bowl of hot, watery soup. The corpse stares in at him with glazed eyes, and Frankl just continues sipping his soup, greedily, without a second thought.
It forces us to confront the biology of survival. This apathy, this complete insensibility, surrounds the prisoner with a thick protective shell.
It had to.
Exactly. If they were to process the horror of the corpse, or the tragedy of the 12-year-old boy, the emotional toll would deplete their already microscopic energy reserves. Without this apathy, the daily and hourly beatings, the constant proximity to death, would destroy them mentally long before their physical bodies gave out.
Speaking of bodies giving out, the physical deterioration triggers a severe biological and mental regression. The camp inmate is forced down to the most primitive level of existence.
The psychoanalysts who were imprisoned in the camps categorized it as a regression to a more primitive form of mental life. When the body is consuming its own muscle mass to survive, the higher-order functions of the brain complex thought, long-term planning, morality, are starved of resources.
The desire for food overrides every other instinct.
It becomes all-consuming.
The prisoners would be working in freezing trenches, literally hacking at the frozen earth, and if the guards weren't looking, the conversation would immediately and obsessively pivot to food. They would ask each other about their favorite dishes, they would exchange elaborate phantom recipes, and they would plan these massive multi-course menus for a reunion dinner on the distant day of their liberation.
Let's start breaking.
Even their dreams were entirely hijacked by images of bread, cake, cigarettes, and warm baths.
Frankl actually considered that practice incredibly dangerous, though.
Really? Why?
Provoking the organism with highly detailed mental pictures of rich delicacies, while the body is trying to adapt to surviving on a few hundred calories a day, is a psychological illusion that carries physiological risks. It makes the reality of the watery soup even more intolerable.
Oh, wow. That makes sense.
This total obsession with caloric intake also explains a phenomenon that surprised many observers. The sexual urge was almost completely absent in the camp. Even in dreams, it rarely surfaced. The primitive brain forced a total disregard for anything that didn't serve the immediate, desperate purpose of keeping the physical machine running.
So, wait. I'm struggling with this. If the body is consuming itself and the mind is regressing to an animalistic obsession with food and they feel zero empathy for a dead comrade, is this just turning into an animal? Has the systemic abuse successfully eradicated their humanity?
That is the pivotal question of Frankl's entire analysis. The environment was certainly engineered to achieve exactly that. But Frankl argues that the true threat to humanity, the real mechanism of soul destruction, didn't actually come from the starvation or even the physical pain of the beatings.
It didn't.
No, it came from the systemic indignity of the abuse.
That is a fascinating distinction. The physical pain of a brutal beating wasn't the worst part.
It wasn't. The most profound damage, the agony that truly threatened to unmake a person's humanity, was the mental agony caused by the injustice. It was the unreasonableness of it all, the insult implied by the violence.
Give me an example of that.
Let me give you the example Frankl uses. He's working on a railway track in a blinding snowstorm. He pauses for just a single moment to catch his breath, leaning on his shovel. A guard spots him and assumes he is loafing. But the guard doesn't march over and hit him. He doesn't even swear at him. He doesn't use words at all. The guard playfully picks up a stone and throws it at Frankl.
Like you would throw a stone to attract the attention of a dog or a beast of burden.
Precisely that. The guard treated him as a creature so completely devoid of human status that he didn't even warrant a verbal insult. It was this casual, systemic attempt to reduce the prisoner to the status of a domestic animal that inflicted the deepest psychological wound.
That's horrifying.
Frankl notes that it was the indignation at the insult, the sheer dehumanization of the gesture, that would cause blood to rush to a prisoner's head, far more than the physical pain of a truncheon blow.
And this systemic abuse didn't just come from the top down. It infected the entire social structure of the camp, creating a horrifying hierarchy. You have the SS guards, but then you also have the capos.
Yes, the capo.
These were prisoners who were elevated, given special privileges, and ordered to act as trustees or overseers of their fellow inmates.
And we have to look at the psychology of the capo. The systemic pressure creates a localized environment where brutality is heavily rewarded. The SS specifically selected capos based on character traits that suggested they would be ruthless. If a capo showed leniency, or didn't comply with the extreme brutality expected of him by the SS, he was immediately demoted back to the ranks of the ordinary, starving prisoners. Consequently, the capos were never hungry. Many of them fared better in the camp than they had in their entire lives before the war. And tragically, they were often far crueler to the prisoners than the SS men were.
To survive in that specific ecosystem, ordinary prisoners were subjected to a dark self-selection process. If you wanted to guarantee your survival, you had to lose all your scruples. You had to be prepared to use force, commit theft, and betray your own friends to secure a piece of bread or a better work detail.
Which leads to that utterly grim, heartbreaking conclusion from Frankl. We know the best of us did not return.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront a highly uncomfortable truth about human nature. Retaining one's moral compass in an environment expressly designed to obliterate it is not the norm. It is incredibly rare. The systemic abuse was a machine designed to strip away the veneer of civilization and leave only a ruthless animal struggling to survive.
So this brings us to the absolute core of the deep dive. If the outer world is pure suffering, if your physical body is devouring its own muscle for energy, and the social structure demands that you turn into a ruthless beast just to survive, how does anyone resist? How does a prisoner maintain any shred of human identity or internal purpose?
The only viable defense mechanism against a totalizing external nightmare is a radical retreat inward. In order to survive as a human being, sensitive people, those who perhaps had a rich intellectual or spiritual life before the camps, were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings into a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom.
The inner hold.
Yes. This inner hold explains an apparent paradox that many observers noted. Sometimes prisoners of a less hardy physical makeup seem to survive camp life better than those of a robust muscular nature.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the physically strong might endure the labor better initially, but they often lack the internal sanctuary required to survive the psychological annihilation. The damage to the sensitive prisoner's inner selves was less because they had an architecture of the mind to retreat into.
Let me share one of the most searing moments from the source material that illustrates this concept of the inner sanctuary. Frankl is marching in the early morning darkness to a work site. It is freezing cold. The guards are shouting, kicking the men to keep them moving.
Just absolute misery.
Frankl is slipping on the icy road in his ruined shoes. The man marching next to him, shivering, whispers into the dark, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and don't know what is happening to us."
And that single comment acts as a catalyst. It triggers an intense internal retreat for Frankl.
As he is stumbling for miles in the freezing mud, enduring blows from rifle butts, his mind completely detaches from the physical horror and clings to the image of his wife. He imagines her with uncanny acuteness. He hears her answering him. He sees her smile. He sees her look.
It's so powerful.
He writes that her look was more luminous than the sun that was just starting to rise behind the clouds. And in that moment of utter physical degradation, a thought transfixes him. He experiences a profound revelation.
He realizes the fundamental truth that poets and thinkers have proclaimed for millennia, but he realizes it not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived survival tactic. He realizes that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which a human being can aspire. The salvation of man is through love and in love.
It is staggering. He is a starving slave, shivering in rags, and yet he experiences actual transcendent bliss in the contemplation of his beloved.
What is psychologically fascinating here is the realization that follows this bliss. He didn't even know if his wife was still alive. There was no mail, no communication, no way to find out.
Wow.
But in that moment, he realized that it didn't matter. The physical presence of the beloved was secondary. The spiritual essence of his love, his internal connection to her, is what protected his inner life from the desolation of the camp.
That's incredible.
It brings to mind the phrase, "Love is as strong as death." This intensification of the inner life gave him an impenetrable refuge.
And it wasn't just love that provided this inner refuge, it was also art and nature, which on the surface seems completely surreal. I mean, we are talking about the most brutal environment on Earth, and yet there is this profound appreciation for beauty.
It is the ghost-like contrast between the desolate, monochromatic reality of camp life and the sudden injection of beauty that makes it so striking. As the inner life became more intense, the prisoner experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before because the contrast was so absolute.
There is this incredible moment where they are on a train transport, staring out through the barred windows, and they see the mountains of Salzburg glowing in the sunset. They are staring at certain death, and they are captivated by the light on the mountains.
Yeah.
Or another time, a prisoner rushes into the freezing hut. He is dead tired, holding his soup bowl, and he tells everyone to come outside immediately and look at the sunset shining through the tall trees of the Bavarian woods. They stood there in the mud, in their rags, looking at the blood-red clouds, and one prisoner simply says, "How beautiful the world could be."
By recognizing beauty, they were finding internal purpose. They were validating that meaning still existed in the universe, even if their immediate environment was totally devoid of it. We also see this desperate clinging to culture with the makeshift cabarets.
The cabarets are such a bizarre detail to me. They would clear out a hut, nail some wooden benches together, and put on a show. Songs, poems, jokes that usually contain some dark underlying satire about the camp. It was a way to forget, if only for an hour. The need for this cultural survival was so powerful that some prisoners would attend these cabarets, even if it meant missing their daily food ration. They chose the sustenance of the mind over the sustenance of the body.
This bizarre intersection of survival and culture is perfectly encapsulated by Frankl's interaction with the murderous capo.
Oh, this story is wild.
It really is.
Frankl is invited to a small, elite gathering in a hut where this incredibly feared Capoa man, known for beating prisoners to death, recites his own love poems. The poems are apparently terrible.
Just awful.
Yeah, Frankl has to bite his lips to keep from laughing out loud, but he applauds as generously and enthusiastically as he possibly can.
And that strategic applause very likely saves his life. It put him in the favorable view of this murderous capo who later protected him. It highlights how surreal the pursuit of art in the camp was, applauding a murderer's bad poetry to stay alive.
Yeah, you do what you have to do.
But it also shows how grasping at any shred of culture, even a twisted version of it, was a lifeline to their human identity.
This brings up a really difficult concept, though. How do you find actual joy in these tiny things? A terrible poem, a sunset, a spoonful of watery soup. To explain this, Frankl introduces an incredibly brilliant analogy about the physics of gas.
Ah, yes. It is a crucial concept for understanding the relativity of human suffering and how the brain calibrates to its environment.
Think about how a gas behaves. If you pump a certain quantity of gas into an empty chamber, the gas will expand to fill the chamber completely and evenly, regardless of how big or small the chamber is.
Exactly. Frankl argues that suffering behaves exactly like that gas. Suffering completely fills the human soul and the conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is objectively great or little.
So the size of human suffering is absolutely relative to the container.
Yes. Therefore, if suffering is relative, then joy is relative too. Because the baseline of suffering is so high, a very trifling thing can cause the greatest of joys simply because it represents a momentary decrease in pressure.
The example from the sources that just blew my mind is when Frankl's transport arrives at a camp affiliated with Dachau. They have been standing on a train for days and nights. They are exhausted, terrified, because they believe they're being sent to Mauthausen, a notorious death camp.
Right.
When the train doors open, the older prisoners at this new camp tell them the news. This specific camp has no crematorium. There is no gas chamber.
The joy that erupted among these starving, frozen men was immense. Try to understand the context here. They were still in a concentration camp. They still had no food, no freedom, and were facing brutal labor.
But no chimney.
But because there was no chimney, they felt an overwhelming negative happiness, a freedom from the ultimate suffering they had anticipated. The source notes they were forced to stand outside in the freezing rain all night for a punishment parade, soaking wet and utterly exhausted, and yet they laughed and cracked jokes the entire time, simply because there was no chimney.
They even envied regular convicts they saw passing their worksite because convicts had regular baths, toothbrushes, and mail. The scale of relative luck is astounding. So, if suffering is relative and your inner life is what protects you, what does this say about human nature itself? Are we just complex machines reacting to stimuli?
This brings us to the core philosophical and psychological insight of this entire analysis. The experiences of camp life prove that humans are not merely products of their environment. Frankl explicitly rejects a concept called pandeterminism.
Pandeterminism?
Yes, pandeterminism is the theory that human behavior is entirely conditioned and dictated by biological, psychological, or sociological factors.
It's the theory that if you put a human being in a concentration camp, subject them to starvation and abuse, they will automatically and inevitably devolve into an animal.
Exactly. But Frankl argues that the camp proved the exact opposite. Yes, the environment exerts immense crushing pressure, but man is ultimately self-determining. He writes that there were always choices to make. Every hour, every minute, offer the opportunity to make a decision.
A decision to submit?
A decision to submit to the powers threatening your inner freedom or to retain your human dignity.
This is what he calls the last of the human freedoms. You can take away a person's family, their property, their clothes, their hair, and you can break their body. But everything can be taken from a man but one thing: to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. To choose one's own way.
And maintaining that inner freedom, that last bastion of choice, required a very specific psychological anchor, required a why to live for. Without a future goal to orient toward, the prisoner would rapidly decay, both mentally and physically.
The source material refers to this as the provisional existence of unknown limit.
Think about a standard prison term. A convict has a defined end date. They can count down the days, they can plan for their release. But a concentration camp was a provisional existence with no known limit. You could not foresee if or when it would ever end.
Right.
Because they couldn't see an end. They couldn't aim at an ultimate goal in the future. And psychological research shows us that a human being who cannot live for the future ceases to truly live in the present. The internal structure collapses.
This loss of hope wasn't just a sad feeling either. It had devastating immediate physical consequences. The source material tells the tragic story of F, the senior block warden. F confides in Frankl in early March that he had a vivid dream. A voice told him that the war would be over for him on March 30th.
He was completely convinced.
Yeah, F was full of hope, entirely convinced that his suffering had an expiration date.
But as March 30th approached, the news trickling into the camp made it abundantly clear that the front lines were stalled. Liberation was not imminent. F became severely disappointed.
On March 29th, F suddenly falls ill with a high temperature. On March 30th, the exact day his dream said his suffering would end, he becomes delirious and loses consciousness. On March 31st, he dies of typhus.
We have to look at the medical mechanics of what happened there, the psychoneuroimmunology. It wasn't magic. The sudden absolute loss of hope and courage caused a massive spike in stress hormones like cortisol, which literally crashed his immune system.
Wow.
His body's resistance to the latent typhus infection, which he had likely been carrying for weeks, plummeted. His will to live became paralyzed, and his body gave up. Frankl notes a terrifying macro example of this. The death rate in his camp spiked tremendously between Christmas 1944 and New Year's 1945.
Why then?
It wasn't because of worse weather, poorer food, or harder work. It was simply because the majority of prisoners had naively, desperately hoped they would be home for Christmas. When Christmas came and went, disappointment overcame them, their collective immunity plummeted, and they died in droves.
As Nietzsche famously said, he who has a why to live for can bear with almost anyhow. But put yourself in Frankl's shoes as a makeshift therapist in the camp. What do you do when a starving, freezing prisoner looks at you and says, "I have nothing to expect from life anymore"? How do you give a why to someone in a death camp?
Frankl proposes a massive, fundamental paradigm shift. He says we have to stop asking what we expect from life. That is the wrong question entirely. It positions us as passive consumers of life, waiting to be handed happiness.
We must realize that life is constantly asking questions of us, daily and hourly. Life expects us to take responsibility and find the right answer, not through meditation or talking about it, but through our actions and our conduct.
Exactly. When a person realizes that life is demanding an answer from them, their perspective shifts. If a man finds that his destiny is to suffer, he has to accept that suffering as his unique task. He has to acknowledge the fact that even in suffering, he's unique and alone in the universe.
Right.
No one can relieve him of his suffering or suffer in his place. His unique opportunity lies in how he bears his burden.
That's a heavy burden, you know? It means you can't just be a victim of circumstance, even in a concentration camp. Which brings to mind the quote Frankl uses from Dostoevsky: "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings."
That is a staggering standard of human dignity, to view suffering not merely as a meaningless degradation, but as a challenge a challenge to achieve an inner triumph, to prove what a human being is capable of enduring with grace.
There is this poignant story Frankl shares that perfectly captures this idea of being worthy of one's suffering. He witnesses the final days of a young woman in the camp. She's desperately ill. She knows she's going to die in a matter of days. But when Frankl talks to her, she is cheerful.
Yeah.
She tells him, "I am grateful that fate has hit me so hard. In my former life, I was spoiled and did not take spiritual accomplishments seriously."
She found profound meaning in the suffering because it stripped away the superficiality of her former life and connected her to her deep spiritual core.
And it gets even more profound. She points a finger through the dirty window of the wooden hut. Outside, there is a single branch of a chestnut tree that has 2 blossoms on it. She says to Frankl, "This tree here is the only friend I have in my loneliness. I often talk to this tree."
It's beautiful.
Frankl is taken aback. He asks her, a bit anxiously, if the tree replies, and she says, "Yes. It said to me, 'I am here. I am here. I am life, eternal life.'"
It's a poetic testament to retaining human identity and spiritual connection right up to the final breath. And it challenges modern society's absolute rejection of suffering. We often view suffering purely as a symptom of maladjustment, something to be medicated away or avoided at all costs.
Yeah, that's true.
Frankl suggests that while unnecessary suffering is foolish, unavoidable, tragic suffering can be immensely ennobling if met with the right attitude.
But eventually, for some, the suffering did reach a physical end. The war ends. The white flag floats over the camp gate. We are entering the final phase of Frankl's analysis, which is liberation. Now, you would expect a Hollywood movie ending, right? Cheering, crying, embracing, the swelling of orchestral music. But the psychological reality is vastly different.
It is incredibly complex and deeply disorienting. The prisoners, with tired steps, venture out of the camp gates. They walk into meadows full of blooming flowers. They see the world without barbed wire. But Frankl notes they felt absolutely nothing. No joy, no relief, just a profound emptiness.
One prisoner asks another, "Were you pleased today?" And the other replies, feeling ashamed, truthfully, "No."
This is a textbook state of depersonalization. Reality feels like a dream. After years of intense emotional blunting to survive, they had literally lost the ability to feel pleased. The psychological machinery of joy had atrophied. They had to relearn how to feel, slowly and painfully.
It's almost like a deep-sea diver coming up too fast. If you are under immense atmospheric pressure at the bottom of the ocean and you ascend to the surface too quickly, the sudden release of pressure causes nitrogen bubbles in your blood. You get the bends.
Right.
It can paralyze you. It can kill you. Psychologically, these prisoners experience the exact same thing. A person released suddenly from immense mental pressure is in serious danger of moral and spiritual damage. The pressure is released too quickly for the psyche to adjust safely.
This psychological decompression sickness manifested in some really dark ways. One of the most dangerous symptoms was that the oppressed often became the oppressor. Because they had suffered such unimaginable brutality, some liberated prisoners felt completely justified in acting ruthlessly themselves. They felt that their suffering gave them a moral blank check.
Frankl describes a chilling moment. He is walking with a friend, another liberated prisoner, towards a camp to get some belongings. Their path goes through a field of young, green crops. Frankl tries to walk around to avoid trampling the crops, but his friend grabs his arm and drags him right through the middle of the field.
Yeah.
When Frankl protests, the friend becomes furious. He shouts, "Hasn't enough been taken from us? My wife and child have been gassed, not to mention everything else, and you would forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats."
It highlights the incredibly difficult therapeutic work required after liberation. These men had to be guided back to the commonplace truth that no one has the right to do wrong, not even if wrong has been done to them. The moral deformity caused by the sudden release of pressure is a critical, often overlooked part of the psychology of the survivor.
And on top of that moral danger, there were 2 other massive hurdles waiting for them when they finally made it back home: bitterness and disillusionment.
Bitterness occurred when they encountered the superficiality of their former neighbors and the society they returned to. They would return to their hometowns, and people would just shrug and offer hackneyed phrases like, "We didn't know," or "We too have suffered from the bombings."
That must have been infuriating.
It made the survivors question why they had endured so much agony, only to be met with such a profound lack of empathy or understanding.
But the disillusionment was even worse than the bitterness. Disillusionment was discovering that fate itself was cruel. Think about what we discussed earlier, the inner hold. The thing that kept a prisoner alive through the darkest nights was often the image of a loved one waiting for them, the hope of a reunion.
But after liberation, many men returned to their home cities, walked up to their old houses, pressed the doorbell, and the person who was supposed to open the door was not there.
Yeah.
And would never be there again.
Frankl writes, "Woe to him who found that the person whose memory alone had given him courage in camp did not exist anymore. It is completely heartbreaking. They were prepared for suffering, but they were not prepared for the emptiness of surviving, only to find their why had been destroyed."
Getting over this disillusionment is immensely difficult. So you have these men returning home to empty houses in a completely indifferent society. How do they not just collapse into permanent despair? How does Frankl look at this utter void and build a psychiatric framework to survive it?
Right.
This is where we transition into the application of his experience. He took his survival, his trauma, and forged it into a tool to help others. Logotherapy.
Logotherapy is widely considered the third Viennese school of psychotherapy. To really grasp it, we need to understand what it was reacting against.
Exactly. Freud's psychoanalysis, the first school, argued that human beings are primarily driven by the will to pleasure, the gratification of instincts and unconscious drives. Adler's psychology, the second school, argued that we are driven by the will to power, the striving for superiority and overcoming inferiority.
But Frankl looks at his experience in the camps and says no. Pleasure and power are secondary. The primary, most fundamental motivational force in a human being is the will to meaning.
Logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, meaning meaning, is fundamentally future-oriented. Unlike traditional psychoanalysis that digs endlessly into past traumas and childhood complexes, logotherapy focuses on the assignments and meanings to be fulfilled by the patient in their future.
It pulls them forward.
Yes, it pulls the patient out of their self-centered neurosis and reorients them toward a purpose outside themselves.
And Frankl observed that modern society was suffering from a widespread epidemic that he called the existential vacuum. And this concept feels incredibly relevant to anyone listening right now.
The existential vacuum is a condition where people feel a total inner emptiness. They lack the awareness of a meaning worth living for. They feel a void.
Frankl theorizes that this happened because, as humans evolved, we lost the basic animal instincts that told us exactly what we must do to survive. And in more recent times, we've lost the rigid social traditions that told us what we ought to do. So now we are left adrift.
We don't know what we want to do.
Right, so we fall into one of two traps. We either do what everyone else does, which is conformism, or we do what others dictate we do, which is totalitarianism.
And how does this vacuum manifest in our daily lives? Primarily in severe boredom. Frankl noted that boredom brings far more problems to psychiatrists than acute distress does. Think about how you feel on a Sunday afternoon when you have no plans. The rush of the work week stops, the distractions fade, and suddenly you feel this hollow dip in your mood.
Frankl called it Sunday neurosis. I think everyone listening has felt this. You hustle all week, keeping busy, scrolling on your phone, constantly stimulated, but then Sunday hits, and the void inside you becomes painfully obvious. The depression settles in because you realize your life lacks meaningful content when you aren't forced to be busy.
Depression, aggression, and addiction often sprout directly from this existential vacuum. People try to fill the void with pleasure-seeking, power, or numbing agents. Logotherapy's job is to assist the patient in finding genuine meaning to fill that void.
So, practically speaking, how do we find meaning? Frankl lays out three distinct paths.
The first path is perhaps the most obvious. By creating a work or doing a deed, accomplishment, contributing something tangible to the world.
The second way is by experiencing something, goodness, truth, beauty, nature, or culture. But most importantly, by experiencing another human being in their very uniqueness, by loving them. As Frankl learned on that freezing march, love is a primary phenomenon. It is a direct path to meaning, not just a biological drive to reproduce.
And the third path is the one we discussed regarding the camp, the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. When you face a fate that absolutely cannot be changed, you are challenged to change yourself.
The source material has a brilliant clinical example of this third path. An elderly general practitioner comes to Frankl's clinic with severe depression. He cannot get over the loss of his wife, who died 2 years prior. He loved her above all else, and her absence has destroyed him.
Now, traditional therapy might try to medicate the depression or analyze his childhood attachments, but Frankl doesn't try to treat it as a disease, because despair over a lost loved one isn't a disease. It is a natural human reaction.
Right.
Instead, Frankl asks him a hypothetical question. What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you?
And the old doctor immediately says, oh, for her, this would have been terrible, how she would have suffered.
Then Frankl replies, "You see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who have spared her this suffering, to be sure, at the price that now you have, to survive and mourn her."
It's a total reframe. The doctor said nothing, shook Frankl's hand, and calmly left the office. The suffering didn't magically go away, the grief was still there, but it ceased to be meaningless suffering. It became a sacrifice. He found profound meaning in bearing the pain of grief so she didn't have to.
This illustrates a basic tenet of logotherapy. Man is ready to suffer, and even willing to suffer, on the condition that his suffering has meaning. But Frankl is very careful to point out a crucial caveat. Suffering is not necessary to find meaning.
Right. If you can avoid the suffering, you absolutely should. If you have a curable disease, you go to the doctor. To suffer unnecessarily is not heroic, it is masochistic.
Logotherapy is not about seeking pain. It is a highly activistic philosophy. It's about recognizing the transitoriness of life, the fact that time passes, opportunities fade, and we must take responsibility for what we choose to actualize in the present moment.
This brings up an analogy from the sources that perfectly captures this activistic mindset. The calendar analogy. Frankl says most people are like pessimists who watch their wall calendar grow thinner and thinner as they tear off each page day by day, and they weep over lost time and the approaching end.
But the person who attacks life actively, the logotherapist, approaches time very differently.
This person takes each leaf from the calendar, fills it with action and meaning, jots a few notes on the back, and files it safely away in what Frankl beautifully calls the granary of the past. When this person grows old, they don't look at young people and envy their future possibilities.
Why would they?
Exactly. They have realities safely stored in their past, work done, love loved, and suffering bravely borne. As Frankl says, having been is the surest kind of being.
It is a profound reframing of aging and the passage of time.
Yeah.
Nothing is irretrievably lost. Everything is irrevocably stored. Now, logotherapy isn't just philosophical musings. It developed very practical clinical techniques based on these concepts. One of the most famous is called paradoxical intention.
I love this technique. It specifically addresses anticipatory anxiety. Anticipatory anxiety is when your fear of a thing actually causes the thing to happen. For example, if you are terrified of blushing in front of a crowd, the anxiety of blushing makes your heart rate spike, and that anxiety causes you to blush.
The mechanism is a vicious cycle. Fear produces the feared symptom, which increases the fear, which worsens the symptom. And the inverse is also true. Hyperintention, or trying too hard to force a natural bodily result like sleep, makes that result impossible.
Okay, so how do you fix it?
The cure in logotherapy is paradoxical intention.
Wow.
The patient is instructed to deliberately intend, even for just a moment, the exact thing they fear.
The example in the text is hilarious. A young doctor has a severe phobia of sweating. Whenever he anticipates getting anxious, he starts sweating profusely, which ruins his social interactions. Frankl tells him the next time you feel the anxiety starting, consciously resolve to show everyone in the room exactly how much you can sweat.
The doctor resolves to say to himself, "I only sweated out a quart before, but now I'm going to pour at least 10 quarts. I am going to be the world champion of sweating right now."
And it worked. By actively, intensely trying to sweat, he short-circuited the anxiety loop. The fear of sweating was replaced by a paradoxical wish to sweat, which requires a sense of humor and self-detachment. Because he couldn't force it, the anxiety broke, and within a week, he was cured of a 4-year phobia. There's another great example of a severe stutterer who snuck onto a streetcar without paying.
Yes, the young stuttering boy was caught by the conductor. The boy thought he could elicit sympathy by demonstrating that he was a poor, pathetic, stuttering boy. But the moment he consciously tried to stutter on purpose to gain sympathy, he found he couldn't do it. He spoke perfectly fluently.
It cuts the vicious circle by weaponizing the patient's own intention against their anxiety. So we've covered how we can find meaning in work, in love, and in unavoidable suffering. We've talked about taking responsibility for our choices. But I have to push back a little here.
Okay, go ahead.
When you look at the Holocaust, when you look at the sheer scale of the horror, is there an ultimate meaning to all this suffering? Is there a grand design that we just can't see, or is it just senseless chaos?
Frankl does not shy away from this. He addresses it directly with the concept of the super meaning. He argues that demanding to understand the ultimate meaning of the universe is a flawed premise, because an ultimate meaning necessarily exceeds and surpasses the finite intellectual capacities of man.
He uses an analogy of an ape in a laboratory to explain this, which is fascinating. He asks a group therapy session to engage in a thought experiment. Imagine an ape being repeatedly punctured to develop polio serum. Can that ape, with its limited cognitive capacity, possibly comprehend the meaning of its suffering?
The group unanimously agreed that the ape could not. Its intelligence is limited to its immediate physical reality. It cannot possibly enter or comprehend the human world, the world of medical science, which is the only dimension where its repeated suffering makes any rational sense.
Then Frankl asks the killer question. And what about man? Are you sure that the human world is a terminal point in the evolution of the cosmos?
He is suggesting that just as the ape cannot comprehend the human dimension where its suffering has meaning, human beings must accept the possibility that there is a dimension beyond our rational grasp, a super meaning where our suffering finds its ultimate answer. Logos, or meaning, is deeper than logic. We are not asked by life to endure meaninglessness, but to bravely bear our incapacity to fully grasp its unconditional meaningfulness.
Okay, let's step back and look at the incredible arc of what we've covered today. We started in the absolute darkest depths imaginable. We saw how systemic abuse, starvation, and terror are designed to strip away your identity, reduce you to a tattooed number, and force you into an apathetic, animalistic state just to survive another hour.
But from that abyss, we explored how human beings are capable of astonishing resilience. By retreating inward, by holding on to the spiritual essence of love, by appreciating a sliver of sunset, and by finding a why to live for, a prisoner could maintain their human dignity against all odds.
They constructed robust inner worlds to survive the outer abyss. And from that crucible, Frankl forged logotherapy, a framework reminding us that the primary drive of a human being is meaning. We combat the existential vacuum of modern life not by seeking pleasure, but by taking responsibility for the unique tasks life sets before us.
And ultimately, it serves as the ultimate proof of human self-determination. We are not fully conditioned by our environment. We always retain the freedom to choose our attitude.
Which perfectly brings us to the shocking story of Dr. J.
Dr. J was an infamous figure, known as the mass murderer of Steinhof, a large mental hospital in Vienna. He enthusiastically sent countless psychotic and disabled patients to the gas chambers during the Nazi euthanasia program. Frankl described him as a truly satanic figure, the absolute worst of humanity.
But the story doesn't end there. After the war, Dr. J was imprisoned by the Russians in the notorious Lubyanka prison in Moscow. Years later, a former Austrian diplomat who had been imprisoned with him was released and sought out Frankl. He told Frankl that Dr. J died in that Russian prison of cancer.
But he also said that before he died, Dr. J was the best comrade imaginable. He gave consolation to everyone. He shared his meager food. He lived up to the highest conceivable moral standard in the darkest of places.
The satanic mass murderer became a saint in a Russian prison cell. As Frankl says, how can we dare to predict the behavior of man? We can predict the movements of machines, but human beings always retain the freedom to change at any instant, no matter their past or their environment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the extremes of human capability, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Frankl argued that freedom, which modern society prizes above all else, is actually only half of the equation. Freedom is the negative aspect of the phenomenon. The positive aspect is responsibility.
Freedom is in constant danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness or selfishness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness.
Frankl famously suggested that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast of the United States should be supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast.
So think about your own life. You are not asking life what it owes you today. You are not a passive victim of your circumstances. Life is asking you a question. Life is asking what you are going to take responsibility for. Look at the blank page of your calendar today. What action, what meaning, what choice are you going to make right now to safely file away into the granary of your past